So, generally speaking, in essay writing, anytime you're being evaluated on your essay, the two primary areas on a rubric will be content and organization. Now, content is the quality of your argument, thesis statement, whether it's defensible, and what actual examples, descriptions that you have in there. And organization is how you present that information. Is it presented in a logical and easy to understand fashion? Those things are very interrelated. So poor organization can ruin good content, and poor content can also cause organization to be unimportant or meaningless. So it's really important to think about this lecture in particular. Think about the organization of your essay as a way to logically present quality content, and to present it in a way that is clear, concise, and easy to follow. Particularly in college classes, many of the faculty members will be looking for specific, let's say, markers in your paper. They'll be looking for a thesis statement in a specific place in a paragraph, and that's something to generally check with your teacher ahead of time, because some faculty members like to see thesis statements as the first sentence of a paragraph. Some prefer to see it as the last sentence of the introduction. It's really a sort of preference thing. Like in my classes, I prefer to see it as the last sentence of the introduction. So length of essay, all those sorts of things that students often ask, really isn't as important as the organization and the presentation of the information in a logical, clear, and concise manner. So today I'm really going to focus on this idea of an essay formula. You see that this document is titled Essay Formula. And the idea here is that this formula that I'm going to give you in a few minutes is something that you can use as a skeleton of sorts for your own writing. And I would like you to use the skeleton of your paper, this organizing skeleton, this framework, for your first few papers before you try to vary it, before you apply too much creativity to it. Because implied in this formula is also a way of thinking logically in the presentation of arguments. So this formula also is primarily for MLA papers. APA has a slightly different structure. So if you're watching this and you have to write an APA paper or Chicago paper, keep in mind that their organization may be different than this. This is primarily for MLA papers centered around supporting a argument or a thesis statement. So the first position, the first section of this paper, and I'm very specifically using the terms sections instead of paragraphs, because this may be more than one paragraph depending on the length of paper you're being asked to write. In a typical composition paper, your paper will be a minimum of 3 pages, so you're looking at a minimum of 5 paragraphs. And generally speaking, the topic won't be enough to sustain you more than 5 or 6 pages. I know that's kind of a wide range, but you want to make sure to check with your teachers what they're willing to read too. Some students think that, long papers are good, that the longer the paper, the better. But sometimes a longer paper can actually be harmful to your grade, especially if the content is not, as we say, up to par or up to snuff. So the first section is the introduction. And in the introduction, you want to usually start off, I recommend, with an anecdote. Now, if you don't know what an anecdote is, it is a story that illustrates or introduces the major debates or discussions related to the topic the student is being required to write about. So in the case of many of my classes, I'll have students read a selection or a reader or a book and develop a narrow topic from that through research. So they would then also need to identify a story, and it could come from a source, but a story from one of those sources or a story from their own experience that will introduce their argument, their thesis statement, and will also introduce the topic that the prompt is asking them to write about. And then the next thing is the thesis statement, which I discuss the formula for thesis statements in another video, so do watch that video so you know what a thesis statement is. There's also assigned reading in your textbooks, in most composition textbooks. If you go to the table of contents or the index, you can look up what pages information on thesis statements are and refer to those sections. But you need to have a thesis statement. So the next part of this is the body section. And I'm just going to talk about the formula of one body section, but that formula can be repeated up to 3 times. And the first part of that body section is going to be a statement or two that defines the subtopic. So every topic's going to have a subtopic. Every argument's going to have a subtopic. And what the nature of the subtopic will often depend on the rhetorical mode. So if you are writing a compare-contrast essay, for example, you would probably have each subtopic be a point of comparison. A point of comparison is something that both items share, and you can discuss their differences within that paragraph and their similarities within that paragraph. If it is a division classification paper, then your subtopic would be something like the different classifications and how you arrived at those classifications, or the way you've divided a larger category into groups and why you've done that each time. Sometimes, like in a general exemplification paper, your subtopic may be based on time, which we call chronology, or it may be based on least to most important facts or most important to least important facts. These are all things to consider, but there needs to be some sort of subtopic statement. The next part is going to be the example. Now, the example is something I typically use the word example synonymously with the word evidence. This is one of the most important aspects of any college level paper. If you have no evidence, no example, you have no thesis, you have no argument. Remember, the thesis has to be defensible. So your evidence needs to come from credible sources or experience. Those are usually the two things, and often the credible sources will be assigned readings, database, articles that are peer-reviewed, interviews with people who experienced the event or study the topic, or, last but not least, primary sources. As in the case of doing literary analysis, you would quote and explain a close reading of something like Shakespeare. So they need to be credible sources. They need to be evidence, and it can take the nature of stories, it could take the nature of images, charts, graphs, anything like that can work as an example or evidence. And it needs to always be connected back to your thesis, which brings me to the next section of the body section, and that's the explanation, or what I call the explanation. And this is where you explain what the example or evidence means in the context of your thesis, of the student's thesis. So basically, this is where you need to connect whatever is in that evidence to the thesis statement. And then, of course, you'll transition to the next idea. And you'll do that 3 times generally, but you can do it more depending on the length of the paper. The final part is the conclusion, and conclusions are typically the weakest portion of composition students' papers. So really spend some time getting a quality conclusion composed. So the first thing is actually a thou shalt not, what I call a thou shalt not ever begin a conclusion with the phrase in conclusion. It makes your writing look like you're still in elementary school, and that's the last thing you want to do. You never want to say in conclusion. In fact, when we're concluding a speech, we usually don't say in conclusion. So just don't say it. What you do want to do is restate the main ideas and arguments of the essay, and you want to answer the so what question. How is this information useful, important, or applicable? You want to give something about that in the conclusion and leave on a very strong note, end on a strong note. Always remember that the reader does not have you sitting there to explain what your essay is about or why this topic's important or why your position is meaningful. They don't have your body language. They don't have any information other than the words that are on the page. They can't even hear your tone of voice. So we really can't make any assumptions about that sort of thing, okay? So anyway, the point is here to use this formula, to apply this formula based on whatever prompt you have for the class you're watching this for, and to develop your paper from there, but stick to the formula. So this is like the skeleton, and you're going to apply the muscles and the veins and the arteries and the neurons and the nerves and all the things that turns the paper from a skeleton to a fully realized paper. All right. I hope you found this video educational and informative, and I hope that your papers are going to be much improved from looking at this and watching this. And email me if you have any questions.